Hi, I'm Maggie Roberts, and this is a quick workshop on whole class teaching methods and optimizing them. So essentially, we're going to do four things. One is just take a moment to define what we mean when we say whole class instruction. Two, entertain possibilities of what that might look like inside a reading workshop-ish approach to teaching literacy. The third are, thinking about tips of how to choose the content that you're going to deliver to your whole class. And then the four will end with some tips for socially distant classrooms or teaching virtually, basically 2020 tips. Okay. So first is taking a moment to define what we mean when we say whole class teaching methods. So sometimes I like to take the approach by talking about whole class instruction as tier 1 instruction, right? That tier 1 instruction is our core instruction. All children in the classroom or the grade level receive it. And really, the network that I tether myself to when I'm thinking about tier 1 instruction is the RTI Action Network, so response to intervention. And that work taught me so much about creating a system of instruction that reaches kids where they are, but then creates some catches to catch kids if that core instruction isn't necessarily the thing that's working for them, right? So if we kind of go down a little rabbit hole in terms of intervention, pre-2004, right, when our country had the Individual with Disabilities Act of 1994, it was mainly kind of thought of in later years as a wait to fail model, right? So when we were thinking about intervention and our instruction and creating models that reach kids where they are, under that act, it was a two-tier system, right? There was general education and special education. And 5% of funding was reserved for intervention services. And in the span of, those 10 years between 1994 and 2004, when the Individuals with Disability Education Act was reauthorized, there were a couple of problems. One, there were way too many kids being flagged for special education services, and there was a hunch that this was a waiting to fail model as opposed to a proactive model of saying, can we set up our classroom, our curriculum, with different tiers that are monitored through assessment so that we can see, these are the kids that this core instruction isn't working for. So we have a plan in place, right? So RTI really became really relevant under the, Individual with Disabilities Education Act of 2004, because it was really a response to intervention that would catch kids before they got labeled, right? And with legislation changes comes funding changes. So it went from 5% of funding intervention services to 15% of funding intervention services. And so sometimes I think about whether you implement that model in your school or your district, it is helpful to think about my whole class teaching methods, my whole class content, my unit of study, my series of whole class lessons are really my tier 1 instruction. It's instruction that every kid gets access to. Now, we know that one method of teaching is not going to hit everybody, right? So if I kind of continue down that rabbit hole of RTI, if tier 1 instruction is core instruction, tier 2 is group interventions, right? So if I have a really healthy tier 1 instruction, there was a school district where they realized that their tier 1 instruction was really reaching 85% of kids that were at quote unquote grade level, but then they realized that 15% of the kids were falling behind. And so the tier 2 method of instruction, which tends to take the form, actually it pretty much always takes the form of small group instruction, will kick in to say, all right, you're going to still have access to tier 1 instruction. You're still going to have access to this unit on character analysis. But I've really started to figure some things out about you as a reader. And I feel like this secondary small group will help bolster you to be able to access that tier 1 instruction, right? So it's not kind of like an either or, like you're either general ed or special ed a la 1994. It's more of thinking about who are my players in my classroom that if I just gave some small group instruction to, it could help them access, make more of, really utilize the tier 1 instruction. So we'll talk about small group instruction later in the year. But if I go on to that second part of what does tier 1 instruction look like in a reading workshop-ish type of classroom, I think about methods of teaching. So as a workshop teacher, whenever I'm teaching my class, whole class, as a reading teacher, I think about 3 different methods of teaching, depending on my age level of kid and depending on my purpose. So the first is a mini lesson, right? Which is, you know, we're together for 5 to 7 minutes, 8 to 10 minutes, 12 to 15 minutes max. And I'm teaching you one big thing that I want you to hold on to as we're doing the work of this unit together. So it might be like my mini lesson is one way to think about theme is to study a character's journey across a text, study the lesson they learn at the end of the book, and ask myself, how does their lesson that they learned as a character teach me, the reader, a lesson about how stories go, or a lesson about this world, right? It's like one strategy. And kind of the mantra of mini lesson teaching is like, watch me, let's try together, and go off and get to work. So after this, there'll be a second video if you would like to watch it that talks a little bit more about mini lessons. The second is when I'm thinking about whole class instruction as a workshop teacher, I'm thinking about read aloud or instructional read aloud, where I'm reading a text to my class. And instead of like one strategy I'm explicitly teaching, I'm kind of implicitly teaching a bunch of things, right? So it might be like me reading a chapter of Because of Winn-Dixie, and there's a lot of work that we're doing together. And that work represents the whole kind of story of this unit of study. So again, I'll say more about that in another video. The third method of teaching I think about when I think about whole class teaching methods as a workshop teacher is shared reading, especially as a K1 or 2 teacher, as a whole class teaching method, so that we are experiencing a text together that is a little harder than where most kids are independently reading at. And it's a series of repeated readings across the week with a different focus. All right. So we talked about kind of like what we mean when we're talking about whole class instruction, different methods that are my buffet of options as a reading workshop teacher. So the third part is like how to choose, right? Like how do I choose the series of lessons that this class is going to experience in this unit? So one thing is to think about, just like I'm not reaching 100% of you watching right now, a whole class method of teaching can't reach every kid in front of your classroom, whether they're physical or digital. So really when I'm looking at my series of lessons that I'm choosing to teach inside this unit, I'm thinking about what is 70 to 80% of my kids in this class, right? What do they need? What would be just right for them? Knowing that some kids might be bored, some kids might be like, I have no idea what you're talking about, lady, but I know that I can catch them in small group instruction, and that is incentive enough for me to keep my whole class teaching trim, right? Like I don't want to spend all 45 minutes on a whole class method of teaching, knowing that 20% of the kids out there might be like, like not knowing what's going on. So then I like look at my unit, either that my district bought for me, or I wrote, or my district wrote, or a unit I've been teaching for 20 years. I look at the kids in front of me and I ask myself, well, what's the series of lessons that this class needs? And that becomes my pacing chart, right? If I've got like 18 days for this unit of study, pre-COVID, right? I might think about, well, what are the 15 big mini lessons I want to cover and teach in this class based on the kids in front of me, which if we kind of think about that, your pacing chart from year to year might change depending on your clientele, right? Your kids in front of you. But every year, the fourth grade team might be always starting with a character analysis unit. All right. Ideally, when you're picking that buffet of lessons that the whole class gets, ideally it's coming from a pre-assessment. It's also 2020 right now, so you might also just be like, I'm gonna go with my gut here, right? Like teachers' guts are really good. And you might say, I think this lesson is just maybe a year ago it would have worked, but I'm not gonna touch it right now. And so I can think about when I choose my content, that's kind of the kind of thoughts that I go through. And then I think about matchmaking with a method, right? So if I'm like, if my kids need really explicit teaching, like you can see back there, I was doing some homeschooling with my first grader, which I'm doing a pretty mediocre job, first grade teachers out there. So I have like how to figure out a word, right? And when you come to a word you don't know, how do you figure it out? And so I know my kid needs explicit teaching of hearing the sounds when I say that word out loud, matching them to letters, stretching it out, right? Like kind of that explicit teaching. If I look at my content, I'm like, I think I could teach this more implicitly. I might go read aloud. Like, again, we'll talk more about read aloud in a later video, but this idea of like, if I could just feel like I could experience that with the kids inside a text, I'm going to choose read aloud. If I feel like my kids need a lot of guided practice, I'm going to go shared reading. So that's kind of a little tidbit of what I'm thinking about when I'm choosing both content for my series of lessons and like method. Tip 4, we're teaching in a global pandemic. So let us remember, the principal in my kids' school talked about it, how like this is a year of pause. And I loved that. I think it's so spot on, right? And so some of us, I think some of you, when you're watching this, you might be going back to teaching full time with the kids there. So you're teaching in a socially distant classroom. Others of you are teaching, some days some days digital, some days physical. Some people are doing the thing where you've got kids digitally there and kids physically there at the same time. Here's the deal. Tip 1. I would aim for less content and more practice this year. And honestly, I feel like that's a lesson that I might take into the next school year or school years that I stay in this profession. That when I'm thinking about my week, I might be thinking about like, what's my one mini lesson that I want to teach this week? What are my 2 big lessons that I want to teach this week? Or when I look at a unit, I'm like, what are the 3 big things I'm teaching? And so I can create opportunities of lots of practice, because I know that if every time a kid sits down and looks at me on a screen or comes into the classroom, and if every time they're experiencing me saying new content to them, I mean, our prefrontal cortexes are overworked right now, right? Like it feels like we might feel like we're covering a lot of material and we're catching kids up. But I do not think that's true. I think what we want to think about in a week is what's the 1 or 2 big things I'm teaching in this unit, and how many opportunities of practice can I create for these kids? Let's practice it together on a shared text that we all know. Heck, let's practice this on a shared text that we all know that's really easy, like the 3 Little Pigs. And now let's practice this strategy on a new text that's new to us, but let's keep it all together. And then maybe like, let's practice this text with myself, but it's a text that we all know, right? So just kind of thinking about like, what I want to do is I want my kids to know what I'm teaching, the whole class, and then create lots of opportunities for them to apply that knowledge across lots of different scenarios, because that's how we learn, right? Okay. Second tip is try to keep it as interactive as possible. Like it's really hard this year. But a couple things I've been watching some of the teachers I work with do, which I wrote down as I was preparing this for you, was one, kids are using whiteboards, right? And they are writing words. Like if we used to do a lot of like turn and talk, turn and tell your partner. Not really possible this year. So kids have whiteboards where they sketch out a word, or they sketch out a picture, or they write a sentence, they hold it up. Silent dialogue, right? That some kids are writing on a Post-it and then putting that Post-it up one at a time through the classroom in safe ways, or on their digital devices. They have kind of like an interactive whiteboard that they're all kind of putting their responses to. What's nice about whole class teaching right now is that even if kids are in their own desks, kind of isolated in this way, we can still have whole class conversation, right? So in both mini lessons, shared reading, and read aloud. Some teachers are printing out emojis or printing out like emotion cards, and kids are holding up those responses. Teachers are doing some cool things where they'll say, all right, is the wolf in this story a villain or someone who has been really hurt, a victim? And the teacher may have kind of cut out, like, if you think A, he's a villain. If you think he's wounded and a victim, it's B. And kids have these letter cards like A or B, right? So they're kind of holding it up that way. A lot of like standing and acting out or movement, and a lot of like choral reading, right? Reading in one voice and you're kind of like quiet voice so that we're doing the work together. The last option is flipping the instruction. You know, there are some people that bought a subscription to digital lessons that master teachers have filmed, and they're having the kids watch those and then come in and practice. Other teams are saying, all right, we got these 5 big mini lessons for this unit. There are 5 of us on a team. Can you, and you know, you record this one, you record this one, right? So the kids are like watching the mini lesson before they come in, or rewatching it after you've taught it. So kind of having a digital bank of mini lessons. That feels like an option too. At the end of the day, you know, we want our whole class teaching to feel like it's bringing kids together. It's the rally cry or the anthem of the unit. I've thought about, like, what do these kids in front of me need? What's their series of lessons this year? And then I try to think more about less new content, right? So we might be trimming this unit way back this year, but then creating lots of opportunities to practice so that by the end of this unit, it's not like we've covered a lot of content. Kids have really, truly learned some content. Much love. Thanks for the time. I'll see you soon.